thank everyone thank Joy and Mary in particular for inviting me to come and give you a talk on something I've been focused on for quite a long time. What I'm going to do today is give you an introduction to the science of technical assistance and talk about how the quality of the technical assistance could be the difference between having a successful research project or an unsuccessful one. And I've had both in my career, so I hope you'll find it interesting and enjoyable. And I should say, when I started to look at TA as kind of using a scientific inquiry, people thought I was crazy. And looking at this, it's such a broad concept, it's like trying to study water. And so I think there's some truth to that, but I think I also plowed the way through this subject, and I think you can use it as a subject for scientific inquiry. I hope that you'll agree with me on that. So a lot of what I'm talking about today was in an article that we published about 2 years ago on technical assistance, and a copy is available. Joy has a copy. You can make it available to you. It's public access. So it goes a little bit beyond what I'm going to say today, but it also has a list of 50 really great references on technical assistance. So I think it's the only place you can go and actually get references like that. Now, when I was working at CDC and then later at FHI, one observation I made continually was how unstructured the technical assistance activities were. And we were doing research, clinical trials, really well managed, guided by protocols, by good clinical practice. Programs also guided by protocols, not to the extent that research was, but still a lot of guides out there. But none of that was there for technical assistance. This was such a big thing, a large activity that both CDC and later FHI360 did. I couldn't understand how in a group of scientists and technical experts we would not apply what we know to TA, to improving net. And in fact, there was no published definition of technical assistance. So if I went around the room and asked you what is technical assistance, you'd probably all give different answers, or maybe no answer, because I've sometimes asked people if they knew the definition, it would tell me what it is, but I decided to stop that after a while because it wasn't that productive, frankly. But anyway, there's I think a lot to learn about it. I also noticed that there was rarely an assessment of needs for TA before TA was provided. So people would go out with some idea of the needs, but rarely was there a real assessment like we would do if we were trying to do some other kind of an enterprise. Often, at least internationally, the TA was often targeted to supervisors, bureaucrats, not so much to the frontline providers who are actually providing a service. And I know more about Vietnam than probably the other Asian countries that I've worked in, but the odds of the information getting from the high level to the service level is pretty close to zero, unless it's something that someone kind of makes a personal crusade. So you will occasionally see examples of where information has flowed down, but it's really not the culture to do that. The other thing is that TA providers themselves rarely received any training. They rarely received mentoring on how to do TA. Some did, but it was unusual. And then once they're out there providing the TA, they usually didn't know much about the local situation. If you're working internationally, it's a different culture. You're giving TA recommendations, whether they really fit or not, it's really hard to know. Then across CDC, across other agencies, international agencies that support TA, efforts were essentially never coordinated. So you could have 5 TA providers come to one city in the same place and be doing TA activities, and none of them knew about each other. There was no kind of fabric for working together. And then the evaluation of TA efforts basically was non-existent, and the follow-up rarely happened. So that's not really a very good record for something that takes so much of our time and resources. But despite that, people still thought their TA was successful. If I talked to someone who's coming back from giving TA, they'd say, oh, worked really well. And I'm sure many times that was true. So I'm not trying to say TA cannot or does not ever work, but I think it works in spite of these problems. But doesn't work nearly well enough. Now, when I was doing the research for the study, and I'll talk a little bit for the publication, I'll talk about it a little bit more, turn it in the way of the slides here. I noticed that the problems that I was describing are problems in almost every human enterprise. So I was focused on health, but I saw articles on the defense industry, on the international finance, the International Monetary Fund. In fact, the list of problems that I described there, they could have had the same list in the International Monetary Fund. Various types of product development and manufacturing, the disaster response, agriculture, and I'll come back to talk about agriculture. But these issues, these challenges are not just in health. They cut across human enterprise. Now I think the technical assistance activities are more important than ever. Programs are challenged to demonstrate that they actually work. The donors, the funders are moving away from funding their own direct services. When I started to work in public health and global health, wasn't unusual to go out and find an international donor actually providing a service, hiring the staff. That almost never happens now. It's almost always through local organizations, the existing health system, no matter whether it's strong or weak. Also, there's a renewed emphasis on local ownership and sustainability. We don't want the services to fall apart when we walk away. And I mean, if we have time, I'll talk a bit about Vietnam, where that's a very big danger. And the other point that makes TA more important is we're living in an age of rapidly expanding knowledge and technology. In fact, so rapid, it outstrips the capabilities of most organizations to manage it. There could be a breakthrough discovery tomorrow, and it might take 10 years to get it out in the field to the people who most need, who would most benefit from that. And lastly, if you want to get a job in health, in public health, this is probably where it's going to be, either as a TA provider or as part of a team that's supporting TA or other activities. But this is the place where organizations are hiring. This is the area in which donors are increasingly funding activities. So it's important to know what it is. So what is TA? I won't kind of press you, but if anyone has a definition that they'd like to bring up, I'll stop and let you do that. Any? So I came up with my own definition. I can tell you right now, CDC hates it. So I know that I'm right, that they're wrong, but they hate it, and they let me know about this every once in a while, that definition you came up with. But I believe you have to define it, because if you can't define it, you cannot study, evaluate, or improve it. You have to know what it is. And even if my definition is weak in some ways, we can improve that too. But at least it's a starting point. And also my definition is what it is, but also what it should be. So I'm kind of stretching a little bit here. Now, first of all, I want to differentiate TA from capacity building. And there's even less detail on the definition of capacity building. All right, it's even worse. The definition is even more diffuse. But basically, in my view, capacity building is a long-term, tending to be institutional development with sustainable outcomes at multiple levels within an institution. And usually it involves money, lots of money, and training. Sometimes when people use the word capacity, or the phrase capacity building, they're really just talking about training. But I think when you have training and money and other activities trying to make institutionals more functional, more sustainable, then maybe that is capacity building. But TA is a type of capacity building, but it's focused on the program at individual levels. It's much more targeted. And my definition is a dynamic capacity building process for designing or improving the technical quality, effectiveness, and efficiency of specific programs, research, service, or protocols. So I underline dynamic, that it's constantly changing, because knowledge and technology is constantly changing. So maybe you could sustain a capacity building program for 10 or 20 years, but you could not sustain a TA program much longer than sometimes a few months, because the knowledge changes so quickly. It's a process, not an event. It's not like I go out and tell the Vietnamese what they should do and then come back later on, 10 years later, and see if they did it. Yes?
Are you going to tell us why CDC doesn't like this definition?
I don't know if I should really pass on their obviously not very good critique, but I will come back and tell you. And then specific, because it's targeted, I think they're like a behavioral intervention. It's targeted to a specific behavior. This is targeted to a specific technical outcome that you want. And CDC's, first I think they were just upset because they hadn't published a paper on this. I think it was somewhat jealousy. That's how I'm looking at it. But they said I should have the word collaborative in there. And I definitely support collaborative approaches, but you can do TA without collaboration, and it's done all the time. So if it's a strict definition, I think collaboration is a modifier. And so I would definitely support it, but I don't think, I could even I could agree that there's times when TA does not have to be collaborative. You're just showing someone how to use a certain instrument in a lab. You know. Anyway, that was part of the discussion with CDC. Okay, there's at least two types of TA. One is what I call pull. And pull means that you help people, you facilitate their access to textual information. So I'm working in Vietnam, in a province in Vietnam, and I want to know the answer to a question. And I remember this American guy came up and talked to me about technical assistance and gave me some good recommendations. I forget his name, but I have a question and I don't know how to get it. So pull would be enabling that person to gain access to technical information. Now with all the developments in the kind of knowledge technologies we have, it should be easy, but it's not really out there in the field yet. So pull facilitates access to technical information. In push, the other kind of TA is to promote new knowledge, new technology, best practices. So this usually comes into play when we're trying to reach a large number of programs or clinical providers where we want many to adopt this new technology, this new practice, to apply this new knowledge. And I will submit that TA systems have to have both. They have to have the pull system set up, and they have to have the push systems. Otherwise, the people will get lost. There won't be follow-up. There won't be, nothing will happen after you leave. So anyway, pull and push. Now, I wanted to give you some examples of TA situations that I've been involved with recently. And maybe you can think a little bit about if you were the person that had to provide this TA, then what would you do? Or support this TA? How would you approach it? And I'll come back to this later. But the first one is the recent research that says if you lower viral load, you'll greatly reduce the risk of HIV transmission. So in Vietnam, where I was recently working, that means a rapid redesign of the entire clinical infrastructure for providing antiretroviral therapy. And they're working on this, but it's quite a change. And I'll come back to this, but it really changes the whole program. So that's one of the things that I was personally working on, and many others have been working on. Another request that came in is the government of Vietnam has had twin epidemics of HIV, but also of heroin use. They've had a really massive increase over the 90s and into the 2000s of heroin use. And the government wants to stop heroin use. In their minds, HIV is a lesser problem than heroin. And so they wanted to scale up methadone services to 105,000 Vietnamese I think we passed the date that we're supposed to get to 105,000. Now, they don't really have any money for it. There was only about 6,000 people on methadone at the time they made this announcement, that they want this. So think of yourself as trying to approach this as a TA provider. How can you help them learn how to scale up their program? A third intervention is to reduce dengue fever. And study this in Vietnam. And some of you may be familiar with this, but you can infect the Aedes aegypti mosquito with a bacteria, bacteria, and the infected mosquitoes cannot transmit dengue. So, but it has to be piloted. It also reduces the reproductive fitness of the female mosquitoes. So the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes actually die out, not just stop dengue transmission, but also die out, hopefully, over time. The idea is to pilot this to make sure it actually works in Vietnam, which has a lot of dengue transmission during the peak seasons. Lastly, the Philippines has been one of the nations that has not been touched very much by HIV since the epidemic, which it's an island. Just why that is kind of hard to know. But now recently that has changed. There's been explosive epidemics of HIV in the Manila area and other parts of the Philippines, and especially among the LGBT population. So how to set up testing systems for them needs to be piloted. And lastly, the World Bank wants to reduce violence against women in Papua New Guinea, which is one of the most violent places on earth. I had a chance to go and work there for a while, and it actually was really scary. You could not walk for lunch without fear of being killed in the main capital city of Papua New Guinea, just as a foreigner. You could not walk to lunch. So, but the violence against women is unbelievable. It's a huge problem and needs to be addressed, and this is one of the requests we received. So these are the types of situations that if you're a global institution or even a national institution, you might be asked to work on. Okay, now I'd like to talk about the science base for TA. So what is the science base? So when I think of science base, I'm thinking of theory, of research, what has research shown us, and program experience and evaluation. And those three together can usually give you a pretty good idea of how solid what it is you're trying to do actually is, how good an intervention is, and so forth. So in the theory here, which is probably the strongest for TA, I came up with some theories that I think most of us know about already, but haven't been applied to something like what I'm talking about, have not been applied to a subject like technical assistance. So I want to go through those and just talk about them and how they might be relevant to structuring a technical assistance program. So the first one is diffusion theory. Are many of you familiar with diffusion theory? I just don't know. Some of you are shaking your head saying you are. Everett Rogers, who was a professor of agriculture, I think at the University of Arizona when he wrote his papers, is the best author to read about diffusion theory, although there's many, many articles. But it arose out of experience in agriculture. In fact, the agricultural people are way ahead of everyone else, even today, in technical assistance. Diffusion is a process through which innovation is communicated and reinvented within the social system. Okay? And innovation is any idea that's perceived as new. So it doesn't have to be, if it's new to you, it meets the definition of an innovation. And many times I've worked on projects where we were introducing a recommendation that had been introduced many times to the organization, but they had never picked it up and never seemed to remember that they'd ever heard about it before. So it doesn't really have to be new. Also, technical innovations tend not to diffuse spontaneously. So like if I wear if someone wears a new coat or they wear some nice clothes, those might diffuse just because people see you. But technological innovations tend not to diffuse spontaneously. They need to be pushed, hence the push TA. And then champions, gatekeepers, boundary spanners tend to be very key people, play key roles in the phenomenon of technical assistance. Boundary spanners are people who they can cross organizations and can reach out to people that the organization normally does not engage. Also, easy to understand innovations that meet specific needs with clear advantages will diffuse more rapidly. So the opposite is if you have a really complex intervention that costs a lot of money, or you have to wait years for it to benefit anyone, it's probably going to take a long time or may never diffuse. So these principles were all developed through agriculture through the promotion of new seed stock. And they found that farmers and neighbor farmers and others who were members of the community were good at diffusing or getting others to adopt the seed stock. So a lot of this comes from that. So trusted peer opinion leaders are the most effective in diffusing innovations. So if you go to let's say you're asked to provide technical assistance to Vietnam or to India, and you go out there by yourself, you're going to have a hard time disseminating your technical innovations that you want them to adopt. If you get a meeting with the Minister of Health or with someone else, don't expect to go very far. You have to be able to find local people who are trusted that will work with you and who after you leave will carry on trying to diffuse this innovation or this recommendation that you made. Now, some of the challenges in technical assistance include the dissimilarity of the participants. So it's often a highly educated person trying to convince someone who's less educated from a different culture, who's more of a service provider, for example. So you're trying to, where diffusion is a process in which innovation is communicated within a social system, often that might be the members may be quite similar. But when you're doing TA, the members are usually dissimilar, and that makes it harder to make it work. The other issue is just the rapid rate of technological innovation. It goes so fast, it's really hard to stay up with it. So that's diffusion theory. So this is very important. It's probably the core theory for TA. And diffusion itself, if you're reading papers that Everett Rogers wrote and others wrote, they tend to be from the observer standpoint. They tend to be observing the process rather than doing it. But they still can tell you a lot about what you probably should do in structuring a TA system. Now, the readiness to change theory, Prochaska and many others wrote about this. When I first encountered it, it was used for dieting, for smoking cessation, and we used it at CDC to try to move communities to be more accepting of behavioral interventions, like community-supported condom use and so forth. So, but I think you can use it also for TA. If you can understand where an organization is in terms of receiving or adopting this technological innovation, you can focus your TA much more effectively. You can evaluate it more easily. Organizations clearly have different absorptive capacities for new innovations. And if you can just understand that, it really opens up a lot of useful information to guide your TA. So I've been to organizations many times where I walked in the door and they said, we're not going to do it. That's a pretty good indication that they're not going to do it. And so, you have to kind of work your way around to how are you going to get past that. I used to have a friend who was a management consultant for large businesses and used to go around and provide consulting services to them. And she told me that in most of these businesses, now she might not be right, this is not a scientific study, but it sounded good to me. She said that in most of these businesses, the CEO is really the issue. He or she doesn't want to change. And they don't communicate with their next level or down levels down to their organization. So all you need to do is go in there and survey the other people about what should be done, what the problems are, what they should be done, and then you tell the CEO, since he or she brought you in, and then he can go out and tell them what he's doing. And that works too often. So if you knew, for example, that the CEO is the person that's blocking any technological intervention, you probably should give up, or you should figure out a strategy to get around that. But it's really important to know that before you go too far. And there's many other kinds of situations that you might encounter. So then the other set of theories, kind of social cognitive, social learning theories, talk a lot about self-efficacy and role modeling, okay? And I would submit that if you ask me to go out and provide information to a very senior people in another culture, in a health system, and that they should follow what I recommend, then I should believe I can do it. Because if I believe I can't do it, I probably won't. And if someone could show me, model the behaviors that you need to do to be successful, that's going to really help me. So confident TA providers are going to be the most effective. And I worry a lot about the organizations I've worked in. We send the people out, and they sometimes sounded confident, but I worried about them, that would they really be confident when they encountered problems. Also, like behavioral interventions I mentioned earlier, one event, one recommendation, or one counseling session is not going to bring about behavior change in regards to technical needs. So I wanted to also think about what are we actually asking TA providers to do, which I'd never heard or seen before. So I put together what I thought was a list of things that really TA providers, if they want to be effective, should be able to do. So they should know the program they're trying to serve, right? Otherwise, they're probably not going to be effective. They need to have enough information to help the program. So they don't need to be a deep expert. That's a fallacy. They need to know what that program needs. And they should have a phone or a way to contact someone who knows more if there's questions that they can't answer or situations that they've not encountered. They need to be engaged recipients and be flexible and adaptable. They have to evaluate information, synthesize it from multiple, sometimes conflicting sources. So they have to kind of get through that because it can be very hard for the recipient to do it on their own. They actually have to negotiate agreements on reasonable, effective solutions to whatever the situation is. They need to be closely linked to a knowledge management system, which I think FHI has actually made some strides with. CDC was terrible at it. And they have to garner support from experts as needed. But they don't actually have to be the expert that know everything. In fact, when the experts go out, they tend not to be so good as TA providers because they don't have a lot of this. But this is a lot to ask a person to do. And so I think it's very important that TA providers be well supported. And above all, they must sustain trusting relationships because no one's going to accept recommendations from someone they don't trust. So if anything, trust is at the heart of it. Because if they trust you, you can engage the other experts. But if they don't trust you, you're not going to get that far. I want to talk about evaluation of TA. And so in the article that we wrote, you can see more about it. But we included a systematic review, which had nearly 1,200 articles, but actually we reviewed about 2,000 because we had started it, went back 20 years at the start, and then changed it and went back just about 10 years. Out of about 1,200 articles that appeared to talk about TA, only 23 were actually evaluations that described the methods and included data. None of the others had data. And I have to say that they were so poorly done that I wanted to have some examples in the article that we wrote of good evaluations. And I did put 2 in there, but they were the most borderline, marginal examples. But that's the best I could find. One of the reviewers of the paper, after it was accepted for publication, said we should have checked the gray literature, that USAID will have all of these publications, because they've been funding TA projects all around the world for 30, 40 years. So I did it. I went back and I checked. I took just a 2-year period to see what I could find, and no article met the criteria. There were many, many articles, but they didn't meet the criteria. But at least among the 23, there was some consistency. I would have been lost if there wasn't any consistency, but there was some, and it fit with some of the other things that I've been talking about. Easily accessible, collaborative, there goes CDC's word, TA systems with continuing interaction between providers and recipients is likely to have impact. Those tend to work. And I think that, from my own experience, as I think back, the ones that people said were successful often did have trusting relationships, had continuing interaction, had people supporting the TA provider. So there was some way forward there. But I should say, and my friend Ward Cates, who recently died, who was a collaborator, a co-author on this paper, this should be a priority for implementation science. This is not good enough for something that's got billions of dollars. This is not a, it may be that most of the TA is working, but we still should know in detail how it works, how well it works, how it can work better, all of that. Now, a little bit more about the practice of TA. So one of the problems with TA is there's so many activities that count as TA that you kind of get lost in the activities. And I've just listed a few here. I could have had 20 of them up here. But I think in themselves, they're not TA. They could be part of a TA program along the definition that I described earlier. But they're probably not enough. But the challenge is actually matching the right activity to the local needs, situations, and resources. And so we have this menu, a long menu of activities, but what's going to work for that particular situation, for that TA goal. Now this is something from, not from me, this is from some providers in the UK that they published this. And this was their they didn't really publish a long paper, they just published this list. They didn't have a definition of TA, so I don't think they quite lived up to my criteria for my systematic review. But it actually is a pretty good list. If you're a TA provider, it's a pretty good list of what you should be thinking about as you go out to provide TA. So I think they, I think they were on the right road here. And I would probably give very similar guidance, but I would think this is not enough, but it's still something good to have. Talk about TA and research. So when I was at FHI, I was over all the research, all the clinical trials, and learned a lot, I have to say. And TA is a big part of research. It could be the difference between success or no success. And in fact, it was the difference in big clinical trials that I worked on. And so like I said earlier, TA systems for research, which is guided by common protocols, best practices, and specific objectives, is an important component. Almost all the research that you do, you don't do it directly. You work through local providers or local institutions. And all of them need some TA, but some need a lot more TA than others. And one of the important things in terms of success is figuring out in your constellation of providers which service provider needs the most TA, which one is probably not going to be able to do the study. And knowing that up front is very important, and then trying to test them out to see if they can come up to speed. If not, you drop them. At FHI, we would drop sites, we would drop whole countries if we couldn't get the providers up to the standards to meet the protocols. And even when you do that, you have to closely monitor, which programs don't do. Programs don't monitor like research does, which I think is a big problem. I think they should be monitored, maybe not quite to the degree that research is, but they should be monitored. I can tell you my experience in the US and in Asia, in Africa, there's a lot of monitoring needed. Now, TA will help ensure research follows the approved protocols to the highest quality feasible, which is really something you want. And it's really essential for disseminating the findings, integrating the practices. We're not supposed to say at the end of the paper anymore, more research is needed. We actually have to do something with the findings, and TA plays a big role. Now, there exists something that is called the program and research divide. And I'm sure you've heard about this, but I published a paper back in the 90s, which I had done a survey of program managers and a survey of researchers just to talk about how they thought about each other. So researchers thought of program managers kind of like barbarians who really never read scientific papers, weren't really interested in them. They actually worked by what I would call rumor or legends. Gary did this and got fired, so probably we shouldn't do that. It's interesting, I wish some technologists would study this, because I heard a lot of this as I worked in program management. On the other hand, researchers, and by the way, they thought about research, program staff thought of researchers as kind of dilettantes all the time in the world. More research is needed. Programs have to make decisions fast. And that was often the biggest divide, the decision-making apparatus. So there's quite a divide between the cultures. There's, one of the references I had done a survey of how many researchers knew a program manager, and a really small percent, and vice versa when they talked about program management. So I believe the TA system can be a bridge between the researchers and the program staff. And it can help the researchers understand the priority issues that need to be researched and have the greatest impact in programs. And on the other hand, the program staff can really help the researchers integrate the findings, and they can actually help do the research if there's an opportunity. So now I want to talk just a bit about operational research, and I think I'm coming close to the end of my time. So I want to talk, sometimes you have to generate new data. So this is called the Cascade Framework. Are many of you familiar with this? Well, I've been using this since the 70s. I used it to evaluate programs for children with disabilities. And more recently, it's been used to evaluate programs for HIV clinical care. But it just shows you these are the steps in the programs, in the new HIV program: reach the population, test them, diagnose them, enroll them in care, get them on ART, suppress the viral load, right? The problem is that the program didn't know who was in which what stage. So we were able to show, and if you know where they are, you know where you can focus your TA and probably the methods you should use. So here we're able to show, this is a province in northern Vietnam called Lao Cai. It's right on the Chinese border. I didn't use the national data because the national data is worthless. But the local data on clinical care is fairly good. This just shows you that there's about 5,000 people most at risk for HIV in the province. This is a woeful underestimate. But about 2,000 have been diagnosed, about 1,700 still alive, 681 retained in care, and only 473 on ART. The whole program's goal is to get them to here. So 473 out of 473 out of more than 5,000 is not a good sample. We were also able to show that the cost to reach people who had never been identified before was going up to almost $500, which is not affordable in a place like Vietnam. And people weren't coming into care. Why? So we did a study. We were able to find that we thought it was first the quality at the outpatient center, but that actually was not an issue. Here, feeling healthy, stigma and discrimination, no time, and being in prison were some of the most important reasons people weren't coming in. We were able to use this to target the TA in Vietnam and hopefully improve services. So in Vietnam, we took a lot of the ideas that I have here and we created a training course, the first ever training course for TA providers. And it was a 3-day course, and it was taught in Vietnamese by Vietnamese instructors that I had helped train, and it was wildly successful. And we then set up a TA network in the country and supported that very substantially, and hopefully it's still going. And we trained about 400 TA providers through it, because most of the TA is actually given at the local level. So I want to stop now, but just to summarize real quickly. So success with TA is more likely when the program and service needs are clearly identified, the recipient is engaged, the recipient has the capacity to change, it incorporates up-to-date evidence-based practices, uses the right methods, and the TA provider is accessible over time and strongly supported. You should think of TA as a system, not an event. Peers are going to be more effective than unknown outside experts. You need to link up with people. Knowledge of program needs and situations is more important than deep expertise. New knowledge, new technology is going so fast no one can keep up. There need to be systems for keeping up. TA providers need to be supported. And let me just close with this Chinese proverb. So after we had taught this in Vietnamese, then the Vietnamese said, oh, we know this already. This is nothing new, Gary. This is, remember, in innovation, anything that you think is new. But Lao Tzu, a Chinese philosopher, had done all of this before. And he said, go to the people, live among the people, learn from them, love them, start with what they know, build on what they have. But of the best leaders, when their task is accomplished, their work is done, people will remark, we have done it ourselves. So I think that's very appropriate. Anyway, let me stop there. And hopefully that was interesting and we can have some questions.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Gary. I'm pleased you mentioned this last work, because I was the KI coordinator of the last Liverpool School of Child Medicine, oversee the operation of the last for 6 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you use the systematic review, try to document or demonstrate the effectiveness of TL things, and you couldn't find many, papers, publications included, using your inclusion requirement. I'm thinking of actually, first, whether or not, obviously, we need these kinds of evidence-based evaluation. On the other hand, both the TA providers and also the clients, in local situations, may not have incentives to collect all these evaluation data and get this data published internationally or using the English language write-up. Because TA provider or this consultant, they are not motivated to get a paper published. It's not very helpful, unlike academia. The clients usually is national program officers or in the Ministry of Health or other implementation agencies. They also probably would not be evaluated by their publications. So that's the problem. But I'm wondering whether or not this kind of publication is really a critical, important, vital, given that the overall objective of this kind of TA or program is to make a difference on the ground. So I understand actually lots of people or donor agencies did do lots of evaluation of TAs in informal ways. So that's why you probably could have lots of great literatures that are not met your inclusion criteria.
Well, I think you make some good points. But I think much lesser issues have been studied in much more great detail than TA has been studied. And that, this all boils down to how good is the program, how good are the services that are provided to the clients, and we're publishing all kinds of things about that. Now, I agree with you that publication shouldn't be the endpoint, but I couldn't find the evidence basically anywhere. I couldn't find it in the organizational culture, although I did see some good practices. The reports of projects that were TA projects didn't include data, didn't use any kind of rigorous evaluation model. So I think it's just overlooked. I think that, I agree that it's not the most important thing possibly, but peer review is an important activity, and I think things will get better. Plus, I work for 2 institutions that could have flooded every journal any month. There were so many people publishing on so many things that I don't think it's a lack of people who want to publish. I think there is an issue about incentives for publishing on program issues. I think there is an issue there. But I think we can improve it.
But I'm not sure. Let me give you examples. 15 years ago, there was $100 million World Bank supported a project by Intensive Health Service, Access to Intensive Health for the poor province in China. And DFID put 20 million pounds to support TAs. Because as you all know, the national government are often reluctant to allocate a portion of budget to buy the TAs. They always use the bank's loan to building, hospitals, cars, equipment. So difficult to understand this situation. So provide 2020, so they set up what's called a resource center. They found a resource center, which I was the deputy manager of the resource center, oversee the technical assistance of these $100 million. So I'm in a position, or my responsibility is to identify the needs of TA for that programs, look for a right consultant globally, and develop term reference, and give them briefings. You mentioned they let the TA provide to understand the situation. So every time they, to look at the TAs, I need to brief them the situation, needs, objectives, all this, blah blah blah.
Right.
So they, after they finish the field work, write report. I should review the their technical TS consulting report and the comments, and try to ensure the quality of report. Every year, the clients at that time we call the Foreign Loan Office of Ministry of Health China, they actually undertake all this evaluation of the technical assistance service provider by our resource center. Right. And they they collect the data, they write up the reports, send to the DFID, World Bank, and also me. So we actually knew which consult services we provide is good, which is not good, or what kind of shortcomings or strengths. So we try to improve the performance of TV in following years. But as you know, people in the Ministry of Health, the program managers, they do not have incentive or skill to write up this kinds of evaluation for international publications.
I think that I don't want to go on too long on that one issue, but I'd be happy to talk to you about the TA resources. I'm very familiar with them.
Yeah.
And I've talked to some of the leaders and managers of it. But I think that it's still science. The information should be put out in the public domain and should have peer review. And see what it's been accomplished. I'm not saying that they haven't provided useful services, but it's a kind of a void still in the, no one could access that information. You and then also.
Can I just add on? I mean, this article was written by, Gary and Ward Cates. I mean, it's leadership at an organizational level, and it's probably leadership level that will probably contribute to this science.
Right.
And the individual program managers or TA providers are not going to be incentivized to.
Right, and we're not even really
do
asking
that.
them
Yeah.
to write the paper. I think it
Because
was,
you have to have that big picture.
that's right.
You had a question about how you see potential coordination across organizations. Early
Yeah.
on, you had mentioned that as a challenge. How do you see this going beyond one organization having a strategic plan to prioritize TA or research it?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult because of the way the funding comes. The organizations that provide the TA are in competition with each other. And so there's a reluctance to share information that might be used in a proposal against them later on. And somehow that needs to be addressed. That's not only affects this, it affects all kinds of other work. And I think it's much bigger than I can take on because I think the funding model needs to change.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you have ideas on what funding model.
It's a very archaic, from the 60s funding model that's still maybe even worse, frankly, than it was back then. But it still can, I think you can still find opportunities to collaborate. It depends on what level of the system that you can cross over, but usually it's some time where you can cross over and work with the others. Good question. Yes.
Can you tell us about what was going on in that 3-day training? Like, what were the skills and stuff that you were teaching?
Well, yeah, we had some content areas, like how to use the Cascade, which is a good tool. Our goal was to have the providers at the provincial level at least be able to be independent, that they could be trusted TA providers within their province and work with each other. And so, so we had to some degree, teach them about the areas in which we had learned, or what we learned about of the TA needs in the country and how to do a TA assessment. But we concentrated a lot on communication and gaining trust, and a lot of back and forth with the participants. We used case studies, situations that were occurring in Vietnam, where they could, and we would take all the identifiers out of the case studies and make sure that we gave the case study, let's say from northern Vietnam to someone in the south, and vice versa, so they didn't, at least pretended like they didn't know who we were talking about, and those are very engaging. I think case studies are just a really good teaching tool and help people understand the reality of what you're trying to, what the issues are and how you might address them. Yes?
I apologize for being late, but how do you measure the effectiveness of a TA that was given by the locals?
Well, we, TA evaluation has been a real challenge because, it was just mentioned, what's the incentive for people to evaluate it? If they find out they did a bad job, then maybe they lose money or they lose their job. So there's some disincentives, but the incentives are not so clear. But I think if the goal is to do something very specific, you have a very specific goal, you can measure whether that goal was achieved and whether it was sustained over time. So if it's about using the Cascade to identify where people are in the service system and move that forward toward getting their viral load suppressed, as you can see a change, you should be able to attribute some of that to the TA. If it's using a new technology, did they actually start to use it in their services? And you can look at many other things, diagnostic procedures that you provide training on. Did they actually use it, and did it improve the patient's health, or have the patient become less dependent on the clinical services, depending on what you're doing? So there's many ways if you're very specific in what the goals and objectives are.
Just want to add, one of the things you could look at is each the consultancy or technical assistant service, usually they provide a TA report to the clients, in which usually there are a number of the recommendations to suggest changes for better, or more effective, efficient service provision or interventions. Now, if some of the intervention, some of the recommendation on intervention or in changes has been taken by the clients, by the Ministry of Health or program managers for the implementation in the future. So then this is an indicator showing the impact of the TAs. Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, remember TA, and I know about the reports, but just my focus on this, which not everyone agrees with, is that trust, informal relationships, ongoing interactions, what evidence is there supports that. The reports are very important. I'm not taking away from that, but if you just give a report, USAID is giving 1 million reports. And it's hard to see any impact from that if you go back to the country and see what has actually changed. Yes?
How much do you think being a good TA provider is something that could be taught to somebody versus is a kind of personality trait or the way somebody interacts?
You know, it's interesting. I used to teach counselors a long time ago, and I think counseling is something that not everyone can do. But a lot of people can do it, but not everyone. Some people just have trouble relating to the client. And I think actually TA is similar. It's a technical type of counseling. That's how I look at it. And that you have the ability to gain rapport, trust, and work with that person over time in a way that makes them willing to accept what you're saying. In diffusion theory, it talks about how everything's reinvented. So the client, in this case, the recipient of the TA recommendation, would maybe reinvent what you're saying. But that might be better for that institution that it get reinvented than it came out the way that you said it. And even in behavior change, you see people will kind of reinvent in their own minds. But frankly, I don't think everyone can do it. I trained a counselor one time in Pittsburgh who would go around and talk to patients. This is a long time ago. And he would go pound to the door and say, open up in the name of the Board of the Health. And I don't think that's a good technique. I don't think he was ever going to be a good counselor. I had another person who could never use the word sex when we were talking about sexually transmitted diseases. So you just ask people, who have you been with? See, well, I was in an elevator with several people, and So some people just can't do it. I'm convinced of that. But a lot of people can do it, and some people are superstars. So that's what I would say. And it can be taught. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gary.